Does Jerome Powell is fighting inflation, or inflation is a phenomenon that is completely out of control? To answer, let's see in few simple steps why the action undertaken by the federal government, by the Federal Reserve, will not be enough in order to fight inflation, and why. But first of all, please have a look at the evolution of inflation since early 70s up to today. As you can see, in the first year, in the first 10, 12 years, from the 70s to early 80s, inflation was very unstable, and there were a lot of peaks. And why? Because the United States abandoned the Bretton Woods agreements. The Bretton Woods agreements were relating the value of the dollar to the gold. There was a fixed rate of exchange between the US dollar and the ounce of gold. When the United States abandoned the agreement, obviously, inflation started to spike up. Then it arrived Ronald Reagan, in the government as a president of the United States, and there was central banker, the president of the Federal Reserve, was Paul Volcker, and thanks to the bold action undertaken by Paul Volcker, the US central bank was able to apparently control the inflation. But why I'm saying the word apparently? That's the question. Is the inflation that we see, that we have seen, that we have been reported correct, or maybe it isn't? When you have a high level of inflation, who are the losers and who are the ones that are winning or are gaining? Usually the losers are the middle class. The middle class, thanks to the inflation, are losing their purchasing power, so they are becoming poorer and poorer. On the opposite, somebody is having some advantages from inflation. Who's the one that can advantage from an inflationary environment? Well, actually the political system. The debt of a country, thanks to the inflation, is becoming smaller and smaller. The tax and the revenue of the country, thanks to the inflation, are increasing. So, from one side, you have the value of the debt that is decreasing, and from the other side, the country is getting more money from the taxpayers. So, in a certain way, if the inflation is not too high, the one that is benefiting from inflation is the country. The politician, the political system. On the other side, the politician probably wouldn't admit that they are benefiting from inflation. Why? Because most of the people, especially the middle class and the low income class, are losing purchasing power and are becoming poorer. So it will be very difficult from the politician to tell to the electoral basis for the electoral constituencies, look, we are, as politicians, benefiting from the inflation and you are losing purchasing power, are using part of your wealth. So they will always say that they are against inflation and they are doing all they can against this phenomenon. But in the reality, if the inflation is not too high, actually they are benefiting from inflation. So when we see and when we check what our politicians, the one that we have voted for, what they are doing and what they are saying, we can ask to ourselves one little question. Are they promising or are they doing what they have promised to us? Probably most of the time we discover that the politician does exactly the opposite of what they have promised. And very few politicians, they stick to their goals all the time, even when they are elected. Once a politician is elected, forget immediately all the promises and start to do different things. That's the reality. So, from one side, we have the political system that benefit from inflation. From the other side, the politician tells you that he's against inflation, but probably is not that against as he said. But I have to make a disclaimer. if we look at inflation, for example, when we look at inflation in country with the hyperinflation, like in Venezuela, in that case, the political system wouldn't benefit of it. The political system benefits of inflation if it remains not too high. That's the point. Since the 80s, the Statistical Institute, the Bureau of Statistical and Labor, started to change the way it computes inflation. And I will underline some changes that have been implemented in order to compute exactly what inflation, or what we have been informed that inflation is. The first main change that the statistical institution made about inflation was to take out the increase of value of the houses. So the Statistical Institute changed this concept to take out the houses, and it has been changed for a concept of shelter. The shelter represents the cost of, in some cases, renting, or in other cases, for example, lodging away if somebody is in a business trip. And the reason why the cost of the house has been taken out, the reason given, was that it includes one part of that cost that was representing an investment. So the way inflation is reported is not referred to investment products. The other change that the way of computing inflation went through was related to a concept. Usually, when you compute inflation, you have two baskets of product, and you compare the evolution of price between two baskets of product in a certain length of time. So, it's important for you to reflect about the COGI, cost of good index, and the other concept that is cost of living index. Under the concept of cost of good index, you have the two baskets of products that have to be the same. But under the concept of cost of living index, you have the possibility to change some products. So we have to ask to ourselves, is it correct to change some products, or it isn't? You change some product under the assumption that when a consumer see that there are some products that increase their price, they change the product in order to face the increase of prices. The other main change that went through the computing of inflation was this one, the new concept. So the Bureau of Statistics and Labor embraced the logic of the cost of living index over the cost of good English. Then the way to compute the inflation went through another philosophical change, the concept of quality. So the Statistical Institute says that if a product passes through some quality changes, they should be taken out from the computation of inflation. To make an example, you buy a car. 5 years ago, you bought a Mercedes, or last year you bought a Mercedes, and it cost $30,000. The same Mercedes this year cost $42,000. So, the Statistical Institute most probably will say that the new cost is because maybe there are few new optional that explain the new cost. So, the goal of the Statistical Institute at the time of computing inflation is to take out the quality effect in order to make the two goods comparable. Now I have a little question. Do you think that the average quality of the product has been changing through time? And finally, last aspect of how inflation is computed is the use of geometrical means instead of arithmetical means. Basically, to understand, in an arithmetical means you have different numbers, you sum them and then divide by the number of times, and then you have the mean. Thanks to the geometrical means arrive to give more weight to the number that have increased less in respect of what they have increased more. So, at the time of computing the mean, they are able to reduce the peak in order to have a smoother average. Thanks to all these changes, now we have a new number of inflation in respect of what it was before the 80s. And here I have the shadow of stats. There is an economist, Mr. Williams, compute in shadow of stats inflation in the old way. So please look at this graph. You have the old way and the new way. As you can see, there is a gap between the old way and the new way. What we have to answer and to ask first to ourselves and then to give an answer, if the new way of computing inflation is just a way to paint an image of the phenomenon not so serious as it really is. That's the main question that we have to answer. The data that we have been informed about inflation doesn't reflect really the reality of the phenomenon, for all these reasons that we have seen. First, is it correct to take out the investment goods like the house, which is the most important expenditure of every household? Second, is it correct to change a product because it increased too much? Probably not. And then we go to quality. The concept of quality is very relative and is not so obvious. Probably when we talk about quality, actually the quality of the product has been along the time decreasing instead of increasing. So when we see all the assumptions that have been undertaken by the Statistical Institute, we come to a conclusion that what inflation has been reported doesn't reflect exactly the reality. The reality is a little different. Thank you for the attention. I'm looking forward to have you in my next presentation. Please subscribe to the channel. As you can see, we are starting, so it will help us. Second, circulate this video between your friends. Maybe they will find it interesting. And I'm looking forward to have you in my next presentation. Thank you.